Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone on here this morning. We are going to get started with our talk this morning. And so thanks everyone for joining us for the artist talk with Russna Kaur this morning. And we're so glad that you've chosen to spend the first part of your Pro D with us today. And so for those who I haven't met before, my name is Amelia, and I'm a teacher here at Artists for Kids. And I would like to begin by thanking the Coast Salish people, specifically the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations, on whose unceded traditional territories the North Vancouver School District and Artists for Kids is on. And so in just a few moments, I'll be passing things over to Russna Kaur. And this morning, Russna will share an artist talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and we'll then open the floor to questions and discussion. And we will be recording Russna's talk this morning. And our hope is then to share this talk on the Artists for Kids website. And this is so that teachers can then access it as a resource in the future. So perhaps referring to it as you develop lesson ideas and also potentially sharing it with your students in your classrooms. So I'll start with introducing Russna and then also talking just a little bit about some of our current and upcoming programming here at Artists for Kids that's connected to her artwork. So Russna Kaur is an artist living and working in Vancouver, Canada. And as you'll see this morning, in this morning's talk, Russna creates paintings addressing complex personal and cultural histories. Her large-scale and multi-surface paintings are developed through rigorous explorations of color, text, digital sketches, and mixed media. And Russna holds an MFA from Emily Carr University and a BA with honors with a studio specialization from the University of Waterloo. And her work has been exhibited widely in both the US and Canada, and her work is part of several collections, including the Audain Art Museum and the Vancouver Art Gallery. And Russna, her work is currently on exhibit here at the Gordon Smith Gallery as part of the exhibition called We Can Only Hint at This with Words. And this exhibition also features the work of artists Emmy Sparks and Andrea Taylor. And you can actually come and see this exhibition at the gallery until June 25th. I'd really encourage you to stop by and visit us. The gallery is open to the public on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays from 12 to 4. And I also wanted to share that on Saturdays from 1 to 3, children from ages 5 to 12 can come by, and for free there's an art activity that they can do connected to the exhibition. And I also wanted to share that for K-12 teachers, there are still some spaces left in our spring gallery program. So you can bring your students to the gallery to see this exhibition and to see Russna's work. And you can find information about this on the AFK website under Learn and then Gallery program. And so this is a half-day program. Your students come explore the exhibition and make art inspired by it. And this is free for North Vancouver teachers. And I also wanted to share that as of tomorrow, Russna will be joining us as the AFK artist in residence. So she'll be working with 2 groups of grade 3 students nominated from across the North Vancouver School District who will be joining us for 2 whole school days. And so we're really excited to see what these students create working with Russna in these workshops coming up this week. So with that, I will now pass it over to you, Russna.
Thank you, Amelia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today as I speak a little bit about my practice, and I'm excited to meet some of you in person at the workshop in a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. I have prepared some images of my work, so just bear with me here. Is that visible, Amelia?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. So I thought I would start off by just sharing a little bit more about myself. I'm originally from Toronto, Ontario, And I moved to BC almost 5 years ago, actually, which is kind of crazy for me to think about. But the reason I moved here was to do my Master of Fine Arts at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design. So I started that program in 2017 and graduated in 2019. And since then, I've been teaching at the university and also exhibiting my work. But I don't necessarily have a traditional kind of art background. I started off studying biology at the University of Waterloo. So I've kind of dabbled in a couple of different things, which, I mean, the reason I'm sharing this with you is because I do believe that it definitely comes through in my work. And so studying biology, there are certain things that I have picked up from that way of kind of thinking and making. So I did that for a couple of years. And then halfway through my program, I decided that I didn't want to study biology anymore and I didn't want to go to medical school. So that's when I kind of, I guess, in a way, maybe put my foot down a little bit and decided to pursue something that I really wanted to do. And so once I graduated from the University of Waterloo, I started to work very closely with my mom. And my mom she's retired now, but she used to design Indian formal wear and bridal wear. So I pretty much grew up in the Indian wedding industry. And if any of you have attended an Indian wedding, I'm sure you'll know it's very bright and colorful and bold. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of kind of maybe fun chaos. This very overstimulating experience. And, growing up with, in a Punjabi household, you're kind of also surrounded by color. So I became very comfortable with color at a very young age. And then working with my mom after graduating from my undergrad, we used to take trips to India to visit the fabric markets there. And so again, that's a very overwhelming, overstimulating experience where you have essentially these very small spaces that are, floor to ceiling, just covered in different types of textiles and textures. And so that was a very impactful experience for me working with my mom when it comes to this Indian fashion design. And so working with her for a while, I realized that that's not necessarily what I wanted to do. So I started to design different textiles for myself. So I got into surface and pattern design. And so I was always painting on the side. So what I would do is go into Photoshop and isolate certain parts of my paintings. And then I would create these repeat patterns. And then these repeat patterns could be placed on anything from wallpaper to backpacks and textiles and rugs and notebooks. It could essentially be placed on anything. So I used to go to the States to exhibit in these really large trade shows. I did one in New York and one in Vegas, and you're literally there to sell your designs or to license your designs to, the Martha Stewart Company or Walmart or anyone that's looking for a pattern. And so I kind of realized, or I went through this realization where I didn't want to make for this like mass appeal, because both with fashion design or the type of design that I was working with my mom and surface design, you're trying to appeal to a wide range of people because these patterns or the end goal is to sell. And so people would become very picky when it comes to certain colors or certain textures. And I didn't feel like I was making for myself. I felt like I was making and kind of constantly doing things for other people. And this also, in some ways, connects to my upbringing in a Sikh Punjabi household. And, I also went to a pretty conservative school growing up. I ended up going to a very small private Christian school. And so it was, sometimes you felt like your own personal voice was lost. And I felt like that was happening again to me when it came to design and the work that I was making. And so I finally decided to just take painting on, which is what I always wanted to do. And so I pushed my practice as far as I could on my own. And I used to exhibit in smaller galleries and kind of independent art fairs in Toronto. And then I decided to apply for my MFA because I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing and I needed that guidance. And I wanted to learn more about painting. I wanted to read about painting and I wanted to be surrounded by people that were interested in the same things as me. Because I didn't grow up like downtown Toronto. I grew up in a major suburb just outside of Toronto, Brampton, Ontario. And the population there, the demographic is primarily South Asian. And so my social circle, my family, everyone was kind of into the same things. And in a way, I felt like I didn't belong for a couple of different reasons. I didn't feel like I fit that mold. So I really wanted to take a chance to explore, what I wanted to do. And so that's how I ended up in Vancouver and at Emily Carr. And so I'll move on to the show. That's a lot about me, but so this image that you're looking at here is a work that's in the show. So the show is called We Can Only Hint at This with Words. And for me personally, through the work that I created in the show, I really wanted to explore materials and processes outside of painting, because there's a lot of different things that I do. And even, based off of my life experiences, there's such a wide range of experiences. And I think for me, that really, it comes through not just through painting, but I feel like I also have to be stimulated in other ways in order to bring back to my painting and vice versa. Sometimes my painting inspires photography or printmaking, for example, both of which are in this show, and I've never shown those before, but I was really interested in exploring the similarities and differences between all of the processes. And I believe there's a lot of crossover. And with my painting practice, I explored in a very experimental way. I use many different surfaces, which I'll get into in a bit. But through printmaking and photography, there are also opportunities to play with surface and to rotate surfaces, to take away from surfaces to reveal something new. For example, printmaking, I included some lino cut prints in this show, and you're quite literally, you have a block and you're carving out of it in order to reveal something and in order to apply the ink, and you're actually printing the inverse. And with photography, or the 35 millimeter, the kind of darkroom photography process that I was exploring, it's very similar in a lot of ways as well, where you're working with negatives and you're kind of loading the enlarger and then you're seeing the image in reverse. And so again, it's thinking about surface and turning things around and pulling things apart and exposing things multiple times and experimenting with timing. And so for me, the photography that I'm showing, as well as the printmaking and my paintings, are all very connected. So that was one of the main things I wanted to explore through the show. Excuse me. So this image here is a piece, the largest piece that I've made for the show. It's about 16 by 9 feet. And the large scale works are often comprised of smaller surfaces. So this painting here that you're looking at is actually made up of about 15 smaller surfaces that kind of come together like a puzzle to create this larger composition. And for me, I'll actually go to the next slide just so you can see a little bit about the process and how it started. And so for me, painting is an opportunity to experiment, to break rules, to kind of break beyond a traditional surface. And, this modular way of working actually started off in my MFA program at Emily Carr, where I knew going into the program, I wanted to work really large, and it was very important to me. And the studio spaces were quite small at the school. So I started to work in smaller surfaces and then kind of take things out of the studio and start to piece things together on the floor. And so it started off as this logistics thing, but actually became a really important part of my practice after I graduated. And, if I think about my life experiences or my path to painting, it's been anything but straightforward and direct. So I feel like for me to approach painting on a single surface or something that feels like this perfect surface it doesn't really make sense to me. It's not how I'm used to handling life or handling materials. And so I've continued on with this modular way of painting. And some of the surfaces that you see here, I painted and, kind of didn't know where it was going. So I set them aside for a few weeks and then I pull them out again and I flip them upside down and I add to the surface. I take away from the surface, and there's so much more freedom for me in this approach to painting. So you can see here, I hope you can see my cursor, but this was the first panel that I painted for this work. And I flipped it upside down here and I started to essentially kind of build this half of the painting. And so I have some placeholders here. This was just cardboard cutouts that I had because I didn't have the surfaces I needed at the time. There's a combination of wood panel and canvas and stretch canvas. And so far, the painting at this point, I'd used a variety of materials. So I've used spray paint, which you can kind of see in the background of this panel. And then layered on top of that, I paint mainly in acrylic paint. But I like to try my best to build up the body of the acrylic paint. For those of you who have worked in acrylic paint, you know that once it dries quite flat. So I usually mix different mediums or kind of unconventional materials into the paint to allow it to dry with that body. So over here, I've mixed it in with some molding paste, but also a material called cold wax medium, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like this jar of cold wax you can scoop out, and it allows you to handle the paint in a way that once you're up close, that you can see a lot of the texture. The paint actually comes off the surface quite a bit. I've also used in the background here some oil sticks, which is one of my favorite materials to use. And then layered on top, I've applied this very textured, this like kind of textured gesture, I guess you can call it, with a palette knife, kind of scooping that really thick paint and applying it to the surface. And then you can see here, it's developed quite a bit from the last slide. And I've started to incorporate text into my work. And I'll speak a little bit more about this in the workshop, but for those of you who are not going to be attending the workshop, text is something that I've more recently got really into, but it didn't always start that way. If I look back on my relationship with text, and typically that tends to be in a more academic setting, I always considered myself a very strong writer. In high school, I always did very well. But then moving to the biology program at the University of Waterloo, all of a sudden, it was almost like the text that I was writing didn't really matter. What mattered was if I got an answer right or wrong in a lab report, because that was the majority of my writing at that point. And so I feel like I forgot how to use proper sentence structure. The creative aspect of writing for me was lost. It was just about recording your answer and did you get it right? Did you get it wrong? Yes, no, okay, next. So then when I switched into the fine art department at the University of Waterloo, all of a sudden I was thrown back into a lot of writing, which included lots of structure. And, it did allow for some creativity, but all of a sudden I was having to write these, 10, 15 plus pages of essay. And I feel like I lost a little bit of the confidence that I had early on in my kind of educational career. And so entering the master's program at Emily Carr, again, I felt like the writing, I wasn't writing in the way that I wanted to write. And I felt like there was too many rules and it wasn't allowing me to think the way that I do. And, it was very difficult for me to write in a very structured manner. And so more recently, in the last couple of years, I've started to kind of treat writing as another form of mark making, because that's just how I think about things. And that's how I see things in life, as just a series of different marks. And so I started to develop this kind of side writing practice, which stems from this process I was introduced to called redacted poetry or blackout poetry, which some of you may be familiar with. And this was introduced to me from a good friend of mine, and she went on to study art therapy. And this was something that was a large part of her curriculum. And so I have like this pile of, blackout poems. And I started to really think about that process of, being presented with something and eliminating in order to reveal your own story versus constantly being kind of in contact with blank surfaces and having to add. And that sometimes can be an intimidating process. So I decided to kind of reverse that and use the process of redacted poetry to kind of reveal my own personal narrative or my own story or what I would like to read or what jumps out at me. And so with the text in this work, I started to revisit this kind of poetry and pull apart the text and play with the text in a way that made sense to me, in a way that excited me. And so sometimes that means repeating multiple letters that don't necessarily make sense, or increasing the scale and decreasing the scale and adding texture and having text be a way to directly communicate something, but then abstract it so that it's not, completely legible at all times. So it's kind of this like play between, I don't know, sharing and then concealing as well. I feel like, ours, we're sharing so much about ourselves and making ourselves vulnerable. So I feel like with abstraction and abstracting text and playing with text in a very experimental way still allows me to, I don't know, maybe keep certain things to myself or to kind of, maybe in some ways it can be considered like hiding or veiling, which is another theme that is prevalent in my work. So you can see here, this is my studio. So I have a limited amount of space to work with. So I actually didn't see this piece together until it was in the gallery. So I had to eliminate certain pieces of the surface. So I eliminated this kind of portion so I could fit this second half that joins in the middle, that seam there. So this half is composed of 4 surfaces. So there's the 2 larger ones here and the ones on the bottom here. And if you will be joining me later, we'll have a chance to go down and actually see the work, and you can probably see the seams a little bit more clear than you can in the pictures. So over here, I started to fill in some of these shapes and forms. And in terms of planning these paintings, because they are quite large and I do sketch quite a bit, it would be very intimidating for me to approach a 16 by 9 foot surface with no plan or very little plan. So I use Photoshop a lot. That's been a process that's stuck with me for a number of years now, stemming from the surface and textile design. But now I'm using it in a very different way. So I sketch in Photoshop quite a bit, and then I start on the painting, and it's very much a back and forth process. So I'll have an idea of where the painting is going, and then once I actually start painting, things become very textured, and I try to get as far away from the very graphic sketch that I'm working on as possible. So that's where all the texture and play with materials comes in. But then sometimes the painting will reach a point where I'll, take a picture of it and I'll revisit it in Photoshop, and things have changed a lot. So it's a very much back and forth, very rarely does a painting look exactly like the sketch. And, that's also not the point. The point is just to have some sort of guideline. So I don't feel like I'm completely lost. And so this is the work up in the gallery. And, if you have a chance to see it in person, you'll be able to notice that some of the surfaces, not only are they different sizes, but they're also different depths. So certain panels stick out more from the surface than others. So some recede into the background, and there's many techniques I use to actually apply the paint. A few I mentioned earlier, including the spray paint and the thicker paint that's applied with a palette knife. But then I also, once I make my paint mixture, which is usually acrylic paint and some sort of medium to thicken it, and then also sawdust or another material to just give it even more body. Some of the elements here have actually essentially been piped onto the surface. So I kind of create a makeshift piping bag out of these plastic bags that I have at home in my studio. And, I cut the tip open and then I literally squeeze the paint onto the surface. So I think I had a detail image over here. You can see how that's done. So this is literally being squeezed out of a bag and onto the surface, and that's exactly the way it dries as well, because of the mediums being able to hold the shape of the paint of the paint. And also, sorry, Amelia, I can't see the time. How am I doing on time?
You're doing great. Yeah, please carry on as much as you want to.
Okay, I'm scared to try to find my clock, because when I was doing that, it was exiting the slideshow. So I might just ask you to give me a heads up if I'm going over time.
No, this is great. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So this is another image from the show. Another part of my practice is extending painting onto the walls. And for me, this is another way to play with surface and process, and also break beyond the restrictions of the surfaces that I'm working with. So for this show, I extended, this is the first time I actually did, kind of like a full bleed painting. I usually take certain parts of my paintings and kind of scatter them along the walls, but this is a much fuller installation. And this is also a way for me to experiment with things that I'm still thinking through and unsure of, because a beautiful part of the process is that if I'm not happy with how it turns out, in a couple of weeks, it's going to be completely painted over as if it never existed. So it's a way for me to experiment in a way that I maybe at this point don't feel like I can on my surfaces. And it's also a way for me to work with the space. And so oftentimes, well, maybe I shouldn't say oftentimes, but in the past, what I've done is I'll have a painting that, I hang on the wall, and I have extended certain elements onto the wall. And then if I were to show that painting again in a different space, the wall painting behind it looks very different. So for me, it's a challenge, because every space has its quirks, and but it's also exciting because it can dramatically change the reading of a painting as well. And it's kind of, it's an interesting way to see what else a painting can become beyond the surface. And so for the space at the Gordon Smith Gallery, the walls are really nice and big. So I wanted to make sure that I took advantage of that and really experimented with things that I've had going on in my mind for quite some time. And it also, I see it as another step in my painting process. I don't necessarily think of a show or an exhibition as the final step or the final stage in that in the life of that body of work. I actually see it as another step where things are still being worked through, and the wall isn't just somewhere to hang a painting. It's actually another surface. So I like to treat it the same way as I do my surfaces, which is very experimental. So you'll see here, I've started to also incorporate some text onto the walls. And for me, this was a way to tie in the other large painting that we just talked about with text that was quite bold. When you enter the space, this wall is one of the first walls that you encounter towards your left-hand side. So I wanted to think about the flow of my work through the space and making sure that there were some connecting points. So this was a way that I started to introduce the text, and it's a little less bold, and it kind of in some ways blends into the background, which then leads to that really bold painting with bold text. And then the back wall, which I have an image of, which I'll share with you in a second, also has really bold text, which is I'm dealing with oversized letters and kind of playing with the positioning and being cut off by architectural elements in the space. And so this painting on the left-hand side is another kind of large-scale work that I created for the show. It's about 8 by 9 feet, and it's made up of 4 smaller panels. And you can see the background. The first layer is spray paint, and I started to work with a new material towards the bottom here, which is acrylic paint markers, which I'm kind of really liking. And I didn't think I was going to like it, but it works quite well to kind of cover a lot of space and still allow you to be quite gestural and see finer lines and have this variety of mark making. And so with this work, one of the things that I was trying to achieve, I feel like in the overscale or oversized works that I have been creating so far, there's a lot of different textures, there's a lot of different materials, there's a lot of different panels, and each panel is kind of saying something different. So I feel like in a way the painting is like shouting at me in a way that this type of work that I create doesn't. I feel like this, to me, feels a lot quieter, and it's achieving the same things but in less layers. So I wanted to challenge myself to see if I can achieve that kind of same sense of depth and complicate my surface in a similar way, but limiting myself to 2 layers or 2 to 3 layers max. And so the first layer here, like I mentioned, is spray paint, and you can see it a little bit clearer in this image where I use those acrylic paint markers. But then the layer on top is that same paint mixture that I was working with, which is composed of acrylic paint, some sort of either cold wax medium or a heavy body gel medium, and sawdust. So if I use a heavy body gel medium, I mix quite a bit of sawdust into it to try to achieve a similar texture to using a cold wax medium. And the reason I do that is a cold wax medium takes a lot longer to dry than the heavy body gel medium, which dries very quickly. And so you can see a little bit closer up. I think this does a pretty good job at showing the texture, although there's nothing like seeing a piece in person. But you can see there's still spaces in between the marks that allow the background to show through. And in a way, I feel like it's almost as if you're looking into something, or I have a series of images on my laptop and my phone that I've taken, walking around Vancouver or back home in Brampton. And I find a lot of pictures that include me looking through a fence or peeking through holes in construction sites. And there's something about like this barrier and peeking through or trying to get through some sort of barrier that's very appealing to me. And I feel like this, I don't know, kind of mimics that in some ways, or it connects back to that feeling of this vast space that goes beyond this restriction that you're being presented with. And so these are some process images, again, from my studio. So you can kind of see how the painting developed and all the different stages it goes through. I've made that a habit. I take lots of pictures during the process because there's some stages of a painting where it kind of looks scary and you're like, I don't know if this is a good painting or if this is gonna end up being something that I would like to show or share. And so I think it's important to look at all of those stages, because if you just keep on pushing through and you don't stop, that kind of perseverance goes a long way. So I use those images as a reminder to myself. If sometimes I feel like giving up on a painting, I don't, because I know if I just keep on pushing, it will be okay. And this is a back image, an image of the back of the gallery. And this was the wall I was referring to with the bold, oversized letters. And so again, for me, it's an opportunity to play with the space, to play with text, and to extend painting beyond surface. And you can see here along the wall, I have some framed works. Some of them are the photographs that I've been referring to, where I spent some time in the darkroom specifically for the show to create some prints. And then these are the lino cut prints that I created for the show. So it's a little bit closer up. And for all of the images here, I experimented with lots of different processes in the darkroom, some which include overlaying negatives or exposing a double exposure, concealing some parts of my photo paper to hide from the light that will imprint the image, and then taking that image away and exposing it again, turning images upside down, which you can see in the small window. It's not very clear in the picture, but if you come to the gallery, you'll be able to get a closer look of this image, which is a section of this photograph, which I turned upside down. This image here, again, was playing with surface in terms of rotating. So it exposed the paper, make sure I'm making a very clear mark, so I can rotate it and have the image line up seamlessly, but also, play with the reverse of the image. And similar processes for the piece here and here as well. And so this was before everything was framed, another kind of process shot of me trying to figure out which ones I'd like to frame and show. So you can see there's a mix of printmaking and some of the photography that ended up in the show. And for the printmaking, I worked with a really great studio in Vancouver called Patio Press. And I was able to really take some time to experiment with surface again, cutting into some images and overlaying on top of other prints, and creating ghost prints and flipping images upside down. You can kind of see here in the background, cutting out, again, playing with text in a different way. So lots of different ways of thinking about layering, whether that's through painting, through printmaking, or through photography, because they both, for me, are quite, that's one of the main connections is layering. You can see here some of the images that didn't make it into the show that weren't, kind of mistakes happened along the way with working in the darkroom and exposing things twice, and having things overlap too much, and then maybe not enough. And so just decided to share that aspect of the process with you. And this is another install image. I tried my best to get an image of all of the works in the show, but it's quite a large space, so I'll just have to wait until we get that official documentation. But you can kind of see here what I was referring to when I meant, or when I was speaking about connecting the text through the space. So kind of, having this bit here lead to this painting here, which leads to the back wall. So, and yeah, I'll just stop sharing my screen here. And I'm open to taking any questions that you may have. I know I was talking quite a bit, so.
Thank you so much, Russna.
Yeah, no problem.
It's so lovely to hear you speak specifically about these works that are in the gallery right now. And I really love, in particular, hearing about your process and seeing these process shots. It's such a gift to kind of see the behind the scenes. And I think from the lens of an educator as well, to really hear you talk about how you document those stages and how it's a process of, even when you think that maybe the painting's not going in a good direction, you can kind of pause there, take a picture, push through that. And I think as a teacher, you see so often a student maybe getting frustrated or wanting to just totally give up on something. And so to be able to share that from your perspective, that this is a normal part of the creative process, and that you work in that documentation purposefully so that you can kind of see that along the way and look back. I find that to be really useful to hear about.
Thank you. Yeah, I found the same thing even with the students that I worked with at Emily Kaur. And one of the courses I teach is called Thinking Through Painting. And that's actually my favorite course, because we literally think about what does it mean to think through a painting. Like, if you see a painting in its final form, it didn't just appear like that. There's so many steps along the way that can be expanded upon that will dramatically affect the final painting. So even from how you're preparing your surface, or maybe how you even come up with an idea, or maybe that even starts with writing. Like for me, the process starts with creating some form of writing. And from that, you go through all these different stages and phases in order to get to that kind of final iteration. And, maybe that painting isn't even if it's in its final form, it's not the end all be all. That painting could then inspire or allow you to move forward to a new body of work or to the next painting. And so it's kind of a process that unfolds like that. So it just, for me, makes sense that that's, taking images along the way to see that process unfold is very helpful.
Yeah, and actually kind of connected to what you're talking about with teaching at Emily Carr, I was wondering if you, like, I also really liked hearing you talk about your mark making process and how you've experimented with different tools and different kind of pattern making processes over the years. And I really appreciate that about your work, that you use such a variety of marks and textures. And I was wondering if you could speak to your practice as an educator, encouraging students to maybe expand their mark making, how you might do that. I know as a teacher, sometimes and for myself too, making things, you get stuck and really constrained in this kind of perfect, really mark making practice and can't really think beyond that. And so how have you pushed yourself beyond that, or how have you encouraged your students, I'm wondering, to kind of go beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like for me personally, that my interest in mark making, I do believe, stems from my, kind of brief practice in biology, because what we learn in the lab, like if I'm in the zoology lab or plant biology lab or microbiology lab, you learn very quickly that it's not just about doing something once. You have to test things. You have to do it multiple times. If you're an experiment, you don't just do it once. You do it maybe 5 times to make sure that you have the right results. And so for me, going into the studio, it doesn't make sense for me to just do something once and then kind of wipe my hands clean and move on. It's like, well, okay, if I've figured out a way to make a really interesting mark, well, how many other ways can I do that? What happens if I make the same mark? So let's say the first mark that I made was with paint and a paintbrush. What happens if I create that same mark using a marker or using an unconventional painting tool? So instead of using a paintbrush, what if I try to create a similar mark but using a spoon or something like that? So I would work those experimental studies into the curriculum that I would teach. So for example, if I was teaching, well, I mainly just teach painting courses, but so if there was a subject matter that we were talking about, let's just say, for the sake of me looking out the window, a tree, let's say we were to be painting trees in class. So I would say, okay, your first painting, you're going to create this painting using traditional painting tools. So maybe that is a paintbrush and paint, and maybe you're painting on canvas. But the second time you create the same painting or similar painting, you're not allowed to use traditional materials. You have to use unconventional materials. So maybe that means you start to paint on cardboard, or maybe that means you paint on this old towel that you've had. And maybe that means you use a spoon, or you pick up a stick from outside and you try to create a painting using those materials. So, because I find in general, students are very concerned with creating these very perfect, beautiful paintings that they can hang or gift. And so it's like, well, that's not the point. We're not here to make masterpieces. We're here to experiment and to see how we can push our painting practice. So those are some of the tools that I would use. Is I would actually encourage them to create a painting and limit the materials that they can use, so they will be able to discover that they don't need expensive, fancy materials to create really interesting work. They can use things from around their spaces. And I think, considering, the last 2 years in the pandemic, where everyone was more or less at home and, unable to go on campus and use the studio spaces, we kind of had to shift our practices a little bit to make use of what we had around us. And so that was the way that I kind of went about it.
I like that connection to your biology background and this idea of like an experimental studies, or like having an experimental mindset. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if anyone else, I'm monopolizing the question asking time here. Sorry. If other people have questions, please feel free. I see some hands raised. Please feel free to post in the chat. I see Marilyn shared in the chat it's cool that you incorporated your previous scientific processes into your painting and conceptual practices. The intersection of art and science offers an intriguing dialogue with unconventional materials. And Chris in the chat says, would be curious to hear about how you develop those negative space forms in the upper layers of your works. You mentioned the fences you look through. Is there specific imagery the negative space shapes come from? Does stenciling play a role in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the negative and positive kind of spaces or shapes within the paintings, I kind of mentioned that I think of my work or my paintings as like this very kind of like iterative process. So some of the shapes and forms that you see in my work are quite literally outlines taken from previous works of mine. And so this started off with this kind of side photography practice that I had. What I would do sometimes is after I would be looking at the photographs that I have, I would get a sheet of tracing paper and overlay it on top of some of my images and start to pick out some of the negative and positive spaces and shapes and forms, because I was still am a very big fan of artist Rachel Whiteread, and she's a sculptor who literally makes sculptures out of negative spaces. So out of the spaces that we don't pay attention to, or the empty spaces, and she gives it shape and form. And so that kind of really opened things up for me, where, you know, if you look around anywhere, if you look around the room you're sitting in, or you look outside, it's filled with, we see the positive spaces, we see the cars, we see the trees, but what about the spaces in between? And sometimes the spaces in between, the overlooked spaces, are way more interesting than what we're actually, like the actual object itself. And so I had like kind of a mini stack of these sheets of tracing paper where I would essentially pull apart these images that I was taking, you know, on my laptop or my phone and whatnot, and I would refer to them if I needed shapes, or if I wanted to kind of build compositions using these shapes and forms that kind of seemed ambiguous, but were from life and from my spaces around me. And then I started to treat my paintings the same way. So thinking about, you know, even my writing practice, or this blackout poetry, where you're looking at a page and you're kind of eliminating and highlighting things that jump out at you, I would look at my paintings as this source as well of shapes and forms, and I would eliminate certain shapes and forms from the painting, highlight others, and then pull those shapes and forms, and those would become their own paintings. So it's kind of, you know, everything is connected in some ways. So the shapes do seem very random, but they actually come from pretty specific sources. That answers, hopefully that answers your question.
Allison, I saw that your hand was up before. Do you want to jump in with a question? And anyone else, please feel free to put up your hand, or if there's a moment, just jump in with your mic on or type in the chat. But Allison, do you have a question there?
Yeah, for sure. Russna, I just wanted to first say thank you. You're just really specific about your process and generous. And I know as an educator, bringing that into a classroom, just thank you. You know, you spoke a lot about your materials, and again, I love that question with Amelia's. You know, we're always trying to expand our marks and for our kids, and I love your ideas about your layering, right? And you spoke about how you took materials and you really intentionally tried to layer them in different ways and consider them in different ways. Can you add like some specific examples for us to, you know, sort of roll around in our mind's eye of how that could work, you know, similar to the marks that you just spoke about with Amelia?
So in terms of the different paint applications, Allison, or different surfaces?
I think, you know, what I heard is, you know, from your photography to your printmaking to all the different materials, you do layer and you use them differently, and you flip them around in ways that weren't ever considered. So I know that, you know, just having that, the overarching idea is having the freedom to know that there's not a right and a wrong, and to really extend those boundaries.
Yes, and I think for me, just based off of my various life experiences, I feel like, I don't know, and this is something that I encourage my students to do quite a bit, is to think about and have that moment of reflection and think about all of the life experiences that you have gone through, or things that are important to you, or certain memories that you may have. And if if we're thinking about identity, because this comes up a lot in my classes as well, and also in my work, um, thinking about what makes up our identity. And there is definitely that reading of identity where, you know, it's something that maybe you can see when you look at someone or you look at their work, such as, you know, race, your ethnicity, gender, etc. But there's a lot of things that we can't see when we look at someone, their personal life experiences, that are just as important to their identity and also influence the way that they approach their materials and surfaces. And so with my students, I try to encourage them to think about even things like hobbies, or think about their relationship to color and where that may stem from, and pull from these experiences and bring that into their work as a way to share a little bit about their personal narrative. And you know, because they're always asking me, like, I don't know how to make original work, or is anything really original, or, you know, I don't know, I don't really talk about my identity, or I don't really think about my identity. And it's like, well, identity is such a broad theme. Maybe you don't think about it in one way, but you could address it in another way, and maybe it's already there. And so when it comes to materials and layering and different ways of working, I feel like we gravitate towards different ways of making marks or different surfaces based on some of our life experiences. Like our choices come from something, they come from somewhere. And it could even just be the city that you grew up in, or your childhood experiences, or your household, or the school that you went to. Did you go to a very, you know, kind of like conservative school? Did you go to a school that was a little bit more free? And so all of these things that we maybe don't put so much emphasis on, I try to pull those out and really pull those experiences apart, similar to how we're pulling apart materials and processes in the studio. And I think that, you know, life and studio life are very connected. They're not separate from one another. And I think there's a lot of crossover. We just have to take the time to kind of uncover those things.
Oh, thank you for that. That's fantastic. You know, and again, that real connection of story and narrative, and that personal connection with your process. Again, thank you for being just so generous and sharing that with us.
Yeah, no problem. And like expanding what it means to speak about our identities and what our identities are composed of.
Yeah. And as it changes over time. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions people want to jump in and ask? Again, just feel free to put up a hand. Susanna, I see. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you so much. I really actually appreciated how you were talking about your background. And when you were talking about coming from a background with a conservative education, or certain possible, may I say, conventional expectations at some points. I have a teenage daughter who is already, I think, an accomplished artist in her own mind. But I often wonder, how do you work with students, especially maybe teenagers, and talking about reflections, identity, and so on, and how to help them recognize different ways of expressing oneself. I mean, there's the idea of I'm shy and I need to be bold and put myself out there. You talk a lot about looking through barriers, and it seems to me I felt a sense of maybe my own empowerment or my expression is about having my own space and not having to put myself boldly out there. the idea of declaring ourselves in ways that are not just in terms of here's my expression, see me, and then being locked into being a certain way. There's a word salad going on in my head right now. I hope to maybe have a deeper conversation later, but all these ideas, I'm trying to figure out different ways to juggle this, not only for my own daughter or my students, but also for myself. And I feel like as human beings, our identities are always changing. But I think we sometimes lock ourselves into other people's perceptions or what we think other people's perceptions of us become.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, and I feel like that's what I felt before making the move to Vancouver. And because you know, like I mentioned, I grew up in a Punjabi household. So culturally it's very we're kind of very close knit, and everyone needs to know everything about everyone else. And I was also the firstborn. I was the oldest. I am the oldest child, not only in my immediate family but my whole, like, my mom's side of the family. And so on top of that, being a woman, and things have changed a lot for sure, but growing up, I didn't always feel like I had a voice, or I felt like I had to take on these roles and responsibilities that I didn't necessarily want, but they were kind of placed upon me just because I was the oldest daughter. And so you very quickly start to realize, like, wait a second, who am I living my life for? Like, is my role in life to do everything for everyone else and kind of put my own stuff aside, or never even have a chance to figure out who I want to be or what I want to be? And even like growing up in Brampton, Ontario, it's like my social circle as well, because of the schools that I went to. Everyone was very kind of put on this like academic path. And my high school had one art class, and even that art class was so small that they combined grade 11 and 12. So it was just like 6 students that were taking art in grade 11 and 12. And, class sizes were very small. My graduating class was like 35 kids or something like that. So everyone I knew was pursuing science, or was going to medical school or law school or accounting. And I didn't know anyone that was pursuing anything creative. And so naturally, for me, and I kind of in some ways regret this, because I was too scared at that time to do something that, first of all, I barely knew anything about. No one else I knew was doing anything like it. So I kind of feel like, in a way, I just did what everyone else was doing, or what I was told to do, because I also, like, in high school, and I always got very good grades in science and math and all that kind of stuff. So naturally my family was like, oh, well, she's going to be a doctor. And, so I didn't know, I didn't think for myself ever. And it wasn't until I went away to University of Waterloo and I was studying, I was in that life science program with a major in biology. And it wasn't until I was like up at 3-4 a.m., like literally reading a textbook from cover to cover, trying to do really well on my exam, which is worth like 60% of your marks. So if you mess up the exam, it's like you mess everything. It was just, I was miserable. I was like, I literally, I can't do this. And, it's not like when I switched into their art program, I was like not stressed out. I was still stressed out. I was still up sometimes at 3-4 a.m. trying to complete a project. But the difference was I wasn't miserable. I was more than happy to be up at 4 a.m. working on a painting versus 4 a.m. studying for like my genetics exam or my, chemistry exam. And so for me, that was the sign that, okay, now you're doing something that you truly enjoy. It's not easy, but you enjoy it and it doesn't feel miserable. And so I feel like, in terms of figuring out your path, I think it is really important to have space and time by yourself, because I think that's when you really have those moments of reflection and, okay, am I really truly happy? When everyone else is gone and not around, when you're alone in your basement apartment in in Waterloo, Ontario, who are you and what do you want to do? And for me, that was when I realized, like, okay, I'm not on the right path right now, and I need to make some changes. Otherwise, I'm going to fall in line with all of the other women in my family who, over the years, I've had some really deep conversations with them. And, you know, they grew up in a different time. Some of them have some serious regrets and are unhappy. And, you know, I didn't want that for myself. I wanted to try to do something different. I wanted to try to make a change so that maybe the other women in my family, like the younger generation, can hopefully look at me as an example and be like, okay, well, you know, Russna did it, so maybe I can do it too. And maybe I don't have to do, you know, what everyone else is doing. Maybe I can try to do something different and still find success in that. And, you know, I don't have to be a doctor to have respect or be successful. And so it's challenging because, you know, not everyone understands that, or not everyone has taken the time to figure out what they really want from life, right? Because they kind of fall into this other pressure or these expectations that are placed on us, you know, when we come from really big families and really involved families. And obviously there's no like malice in anything. Everyone wants what's best for you, but you know, I truly feel like only you know what is best for you. You have to figure that out. Otherwise, it's really tough, right? It can be a very tough life to find happiness. And so you know, I don't know, you know, when I talk to my students, I try to share from my own experiences, and you know, because I was in their shoes not so long ago, so I understand it's a confusing time to be, you know, a teenager or, you know, a young undergrad student. There's lots going on, and so it's just trying to encourage them to reflect and take that time to be by themselves, away from distractions and everything, and just really think like what they want to do with their life. And it can also change, right? Like I also know people who, you know, figured out they wanted to do something completely different at age 40 or 60, or, you know, it's like, it's not like a clear path. There's so much that can change.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to say thank you as well. And I think, yeah, as with an eye on the time, I wanted to wind things down. But thank you so much for your generosity and sharing about your process, but also your life experiences. I think that means a lot to all of us here to hear about your story. And I know Geneva wrote in the chat here, I think this is a nice sort of summation. She says, thank you for being so honest and sharing your story. I think you're brave for pursuing sciences and using that experience to influence your art making process. It's so cool. So I think with that sentiment, I will wind things down as we've reached 10 o'clock here. And so I will end the meeting there. Thank you everyone for attending and for your questions and reflections here. And thank you once again, Russna, for your generosity. And so for those of you who are joining us for the in-person workshop this later this morning, it will begin at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.